So, you've watched 3 episodes of Ozark, binged Breaking Bad for the 5th time, and now you're sitting there thinking, hey, I could totally wash a few $1 million without the IRS noticing, right? Well, not before you know these tricks, because we need to have a serious chat about why your plan is absolutely terrible, why you definitely don't have the stamina for high-stakes financial crime. Casino and gambling laundering. Casino and gambling laundering, which sounds like something straight out of a James Bond movie where Daniel Craig stares intensely at a martini, is, in reality, a lot less glamorous and a lot more about basic math. So the concept is simple, because all you're really doing is taking your dirty cash and walking into a casino to exchange it for chips. Once you have those chips, the trick isn't to go all in and lose everything like a degenerate gambler. No, you play just enough to make it look like you're there to have a good time. Maybe you lose a few hands on purpose, play some roulette, red or black style, and then you cash out the remaining chips. But here's the 200 IQ play. You ask for the payout in a check or a wire transfer, essentially turning that sketchy pile of bills into legitimate gambling winnings, which is basically magic, cleaning your money. You can withdraw it back out, effectively mixing your coins until they are untraceable. Smurfing. Speaking of fees and trying to keep things under the radar, we're now here at our second tactic on our list, which is affectionately known as smurfing. And yes, it is literally named after those little blue guys who live in mushrooms, or if you want to sound like a boring accountant, structuring. The whole idea is taking one massive pile of cash and breaking it down into tiny little harmless chunks, which sounds genius on paper, right? But here's the deal. Banks are complete snitches, and in the US, if you walk in with more than $10,000 in cash, they have to file a currency transaction report, which goes straight to the feds. The play here is to keep your deposits under that limit, but wait. It gets trickier because if you just deposit $9,999, the bank teller is definitely snitching because that is painfully obvious structuring. So you have to get creative and spread it out, essentially hiring a bunch of random people to run around town, hitting up different banks, running around depositing $3,000 here and $4,000 there. Unfortunately, finding reliable Smurfs is a nightmare because you're trusting random people with your hard-earned illegal money. And let's face it, finding good help these days is harder than finding a working ice cream machine at McDonald's. So while structuring is definitely a tactic you need to know about, it carries a risk factor. Trade-based money laundering. Let's move on to the absolute heavy hitter of the financial underworld. Tactic number 3 is what the pros call trade-based money laundering, or TBML if you want to save time. The entire concept relies on the fact that global trade is massive and messy, literally trillions of dollars moving around every day in shipping containers, which creates this perfect chaotic noise for you to hide in. Basically, instead of wiring money directly, which banks track like hawks, you move value by falsifying invoices. Matter of fact, let's say you want to move $10 million of dirty money out of the country. You don't send a wire transfer. You simply buy a shipment of cheap electronics from your partner overseas. Maybe some old headphones that are worth $5 a pop. But here's the magic trick. You invoice them at $5,000 a piece. And when you pay that inflated bill, the money moves across the border perfectly legally disguised as a trade settlement. Which is exactly why this is so hard to stop, because value is subjective. I mean, maybe you really do believe those AliExpress headphones are vintage collectibles. Who's the bank to tell you otherwise? However, it leads us to the reality that in 2026, as digital surveillance gets tighter, physical trade remains the biggest blind spot in the global economy. Autonomous AI laundering. But if you really want to see where the smart money's going, you have to look at Tactic 4, which is autonomous AI laundering. Now it's just code talking to code. Imagine having an army of AI agents that never sleep and don't make mistakes. Essentially having a swarm of synthetic identities that look so real they even have fake LinkedIn profiles with endorsements. Which is exactly why the banks are freaking out. Because these AI bots can spin up thousands of shell companies in seconds, register the domains, build fully functional websites with fake products, and even generate fake customer reviews that sound more human than your actual aunt on Facebook. And the best part is that they start moving money back and forth between these phantom companies in tiny, irregular amounts that act like digital chaff to confuse the algorithms. You essentially have a silent global network moving millions right under the nose of the IRS. Not to mention the fact that these AI agents can handle the compliance checks themselves, answering emails from suspicious bankers with perfectly crafted responses that use the right corporate words to make everything seem legit. So the compliance officer thinks he's talking to a CEO named Gary from Delaware, but he's actually chatting with a heavy-duty language model running on a server in a basement somewhere. So anyway, as we move deeper into 2026, the real ones aren't even touching the money. They're just the architects designing the systems that run themselves, leaving the algorithms to do the dirty work. Real estate laundering. Next up, we have real estate laundering, arguably the heavyweight champion at turning dirty money into generational wealth. The concept is simple. It's where you take your dirty cash and purchase a property, but you never do it in your own name. Instead, you use a layered structure, shell companies, or a straw buyer who stands in for you. Basically just a regular guy with a clean record who takes a fee to sign the papers, which is exactly why this sector is so hard to police. Because once the money is converted into a house or a commercial building, it stops looking like criminal loot and starts looking like the American dream. Plus, you avoid mortgages early by opting for an all-cash purchase, which bypasses the intense scrutiny of bank lenders who are usually the ones blowing the whistle on suspicious activity, allowing you to park millions in a high-rise condo that you have zero intention of living in. And once you own the asset, you can double down by doing some renovations where you hire a construction company that you secretly control to do work on the property, creating a situation where you bill yourself absurd amounts of money for upgrades, maybe charging $50,000 for a job that costs $500, effectively moving your dirty cash into the legitimate economy as business revenue for the construction firm. Not to mention the fact that this increases the value of the house, so when you sell it, the profit is tax paid and completely clean, which is a level of financial gymnastics that would confuse even the smartest accountants at Dunder Mifflin. But for you, it's just another Tuesday. Shell companies and trusts. This and the real estate laundering tactic are intertwined. You can call it the old school world of corporate structures, because once you realize that digital hops leave a permanent footprint, you start looking for something with a bit more legal weight behind it. Basically, you're trying to bury the paper trail under mountains of legitimate-looking paperwork. So enter the world of shell companies and trusts, which people think is some high-tech wizardry, but really, it's just a game of corporate hide-and-seek. You buy a house, but instead of your name on the deed, it's a company's name. And that company's owned by another company. And that company is owned by a trust in a jurisdiction that treats privacy like a religion. And that creates a dense fog where the actual human being at the end of the chain is totally obscured. The logic is that if you layer enough of these empty shells on top of each other, investigators will just give up out of sheer boredom or lack of jurisdiction, allowing the funds to sit there looking squeaky clean, especially when you bring trusts into the mix, because technically you don't even own the assets anymore. The trust does, and you're just a beneficiary, which is a distinction that lawyers love to argue about over expensive lunches, giving you plausible deniability. But here's the kicker that ruins the whole party. Governments caught on to this ages ago and started rolling out things like beneficial ownership registries and the Corporate Transparency Act, meaning that secrecy veil is getting thinner by the day, forcing these complex structures to either get even more convoluted or risk immediate exposure the moment a bank asks a simple compliance question, creating a scenario where you've spent a fortune on setup fees only to realize that the walls are glass. Havala and alternative remittance systems. Moving right along from the heavy lifting of real estate and raw land development where the transactions are massive and slow, we have to pivot to something that moves at the speed of a text message, and is frankly way harder to track. Specifically, Havala and other alternative remittance systems. Honestly, it's wild because while the modern world is obsessed with blockchain and digital ledgers, this ancient method has been ghosting the banking system since the Silk Road days, operating like a financial teleportation device that leaves zero digital footprints, which is exactly why it remains a top-tier method for moving value without triggering those pesky suspicious activity reports. Basically, how it works is remarkably easy yet effective. You walk into a broker's office in, say, New York, which might just look like a regular travel agency or a corner store selling calling cards, and you hand over your cash to the Havala, who then gives you a unique code or a token, and then he simply messages his counterpart in the destination city, let's say London or Dubai, instructing them to release the equivalent amount to your recipient, who just has to show up and say the magic words. So no physical money actually crosses the border. It's all just a system of credits and debits between the brokers. Not to mention the fact that because there's no wire transfers pinging through the SWIFT network, it creates a massive blind spot for the authorities who are looking for electronic trails. Matter of fact, the settlement between brokers happens weeks or months later, and usually through trade misinvoicing, meaning the money laundering is completely hidden inside legitimate commerce, which creates a nightmare for auditors trying to follow the money. Crypto laundering and privacy tools. Next on the list, we have crypto laundering and privacy tools that promise anonymity, but often deliver a one-way ticket to an indictment. See, the biggest myth out there is that crypto is the shadowy underworld where nobody knows who you are, but the reality is that the blockchain is a public ledger and records every single transaction forever. Meaning if you move money on it, you're basically leaving a permanent digital fingerprint that never fades, which is exactly why people trying to clean dirty money turn to mixers or tumblers, services that take your coins and throw them into a giant pool with thousands of other people's coins, shaking them up and spitting them out into different addresses in an attempt to break the link between the sender and the receiver. But here creates the problem, because advanced chain analysis firms now use AI to track these movements through the mix, creating a visualization of the flow that lights up like a Christmas tree, basically giving investigators a roadmap right to your door. It's wild because this cat and mouse game has pushed some privacy coins which use fancy tech like ring signatures to obfuscate the sender, effectively putting a digital cloak over the transaction, but the issue there is liquidity, because regulators have cracked down so hard that major exchanges have delisted these privacy tokens, meaning you might have millions in crypto but nowhere to convert it to fiat, leaving you with a fortune that's technically yours but practically useless. Not to mention the fact that simply interacting with a mixer or a known privacy wallet flags your address as high risk immediately, causing legitimate exchanges to freeze your accounts instantly. So while tech might look sophisticated on paper, the practical application involves navigating a minefield, which leads us to our next tack: cash-intensive businesses. While everyone's obsessed with complex offshore accounts that act like glass houses, the smartest operators know that sometimes the best way to hide in plain sight is to go decidedly analog. Which brings us to our last tactic, the absolute classic: cash-intensive businesses. Because, let's face it, digital footprints are forever, but cash is just paper. So the logic here is deceptively simple. You simply own a business that deals in actual physical currency. We're talking laundromats, car washes, vending machines, or even those shady parking lots where the machine always seems to be broken. And the beauty of it is commingling, essentially mixing your dirty money with legitimate customer revenue, creating a smoothie of funds that the IRS finds incredibly hard to separate flavor-wise, which creates this beautiful gray area where you can claim you sold 500 premium car washes when you really only sold 50, filling the gap with the cash from your other ventures, creating a legitimate tax trail for illegitimate funds. It's basically the Walter White strategy, because having a legitimate front gives you a W-2, a tax return, and a reason to exist in the financial system without raising those red flags we talked about earlier. Besides, you can't just dump cash into the till anymore since forensic accounting software is terrifyingly good at spotting statistical anomalies, meaning if you report that 90% of your revenue is bills in a world where everyone is tapping their phone to pay for a stick of gum, the algorithm at the bank is going to look at you with pure suspicion and disdain. So to make this work in the modern era, you have to be smarter about your variable costs. You can't just fake the revenue, you have to fake the expenses too. Buying extra soap, extra water, or extra lemons if you're running a stand. Because the feds are looking at your margins, and if you claim to make $1 million selling pizza, but you only bought 50 pounds of cheese, the math isn't mathing and you're going to jail. Just think a little harder when fabricating the prices, and you're solid.